The year was 1882, and the small town of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, sat like a weathered jewel in the vast desert landscape. Sheriff Jake Morrison stood on the wooden boardwalk outside his office, his keen blue eyes scanning the dusty main street as the morning sun painted the adobe buildings in shades of gold and amber. At 28 years old, Jake had already earned a reputation as one of the most honest lawmen in the territory, a rare quality in an era when corruption often wore a badge. The town of Copper Creek had sprung up almost overnight when prospectors discovered copper deposits in the nearby hills 5 years earlier. What started as a collection of tents and makeshift shelters had grown into a proper settlement with a general store, saloon, church, schoolhouse, and even a small hotel. The railroad had promised to extend their line to Copper Creek, bringing with it the hope of prosperity and growth. Jake adjusted his worn leather gun belt, feeling the familiar weight of his Colt .45 Peacemaker, a weapon that had served him well during his years as a lawman. His silver sheriff's star, polished to a shine, caught the morning light. He had pinned on that star 3 years ago when the previous sheriff had been gunned down by cattle rustlers, and Jake had been the only man brave enough to take the job. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caught his attention, and Jake looked up to see a stagecoach rumbling down the main street, its wheels kicking up clouds of red dust. The Wells Fargo stage was right on time as always. Jake knew that among the passengers would be newcomers seeking their fortune in the copper mines, traveling salesmen with their wares, and perhaps a few unsavory characters looking for easy prey in a growing frontier town. As the stagecoach came to a halt outside the hotel, Jake noticed something unusual. Instead of the typical collection of dusty miners and weathered travelers, an elegant woman stepped down from the coach. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that, despite the long journey, still looked remarkably clean and proper. Her auburn hair was pinned up beneath a small hat adorned with a single feather, and her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and determination. Jake found himself staring, forgetting for a moment his duties as sheriff. The woman was beautiful, certainly, but there was something else about her, a confidence and strength that seemed unusual for a lady traveling alone in the rough Arizona territory. "Sheriff Morrison?" The woman's voice carried a slight Eastern accent as she approached him, her small leather satchel clutched in her gloved hands. "Yes, ma'am." "That would be me," Jake replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "What can I do for you?" "My name is Miss Catherine Wells. I've come to Copper Creek to open a school. I was told you might be able to help me find suitable lodgings and perhaps provide some information about the town." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. A schoolteacher, and a beautiful one at that. Copper Creek had been trying to attract a qualified teacher for over a year, but few educated people wanted to venture into the rough frontier territory. "Miss Wells, it's a pleasure to meet you," Jake said, his usual confidence wavering slightly under her direct gaze. "The town council has been hoping someone like you would come along. We've got about 20 children who need proper schooling, and the old schoolhouse just needs a bit of fixing up." Catherine smiled, and Jake felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with his duties as a lawman. "I'm looking forward to meeting the children and their families. But first, I suppose I should find a place to stay." "Mrs. Henderson runs the boarding house just down the street," Jake offered, pointing to a 2-story wooden building with a painted sign. "She's a good Christian woman who looks after her guests proper. I'll walk you over there and introduce you if you'd like." As they walked down the boardwalk together, Jake couldn't help but notice how Catherine carried herself with dignity despite the obvious challenges of frontier life. Her dress boots clicked against the wooden planks, and she observed everything around her with curious, intelligent eyes. "Tell me about Copper Creek, Sheriff Morrison," Catherine said as they walked. "What should I know about this place I'm going to call home?" Jake considered his words carefully. He wanted to be honest about the challenges she would face, but he didn't want to frighten her away before she'd even had a chance to settle in. "Well, Miss Wells, Copper Creek is a growing town with good people, but it's still the frontier. We've got hard-working miners and ranchers, families trying to build something lasting out here. But we also get our share of trouble, cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, and occasionally some rough characters passing through. That's why we need law and order, and it's why we need education for our children." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, Sheriff. I didn't come here expecting an easy life. I came here because I believe education can help civilize and improve any community, no matter how rough its beginnings." Her words impressed Jake more than he cared to admit. Here was a woman who understood the challenges but wasn't afraid to face them. As they reached the boarding house, Jake found himself reluctant to say goodbye. "Mrs. Henderson," Jake called out as they entered the tidy establishment. "I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Wells, our new schoolteacher." Emma Henderson, a plump woman in her 50s with graying hair and a kind smile, bustled out from behind the front desk. "Oh my stars. The schoolteacher has finally arrived. Welcome to Copper Creek, dear. We've been praying someone like you would come along." As Jake watched Catherine settle in with Mrs. Henderson, discussing room rates and meal times, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and concern. The arrival of such a remarkable woman would certainly be good for the town, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that her presence might complicate his own life in ways he hadn't anticipated. That evening, as Jake made his rounds through town, he found his thoughts continually drifting back to Catherine Wells. Her green eyes, her confident smile, the way she'd spoken about bringing education to the frontier, it all made an impression on him that he couldn't easily dismiss. Jake had always prided himself on being focused and dedicated to his job. In 3 years as sheriff, he'd never let personal feelings interfere with his duties. He'd never had a serious romantic relationship, telling himself that a lawman's life was too dangerous and unpredictable for such luxuries. But something about Catherine Wells made him question those long-held beliefs. As he checked the locks on the bank and peered into the darkened windows of the general store, Jake heard the sound of piano music drifting from the Golden Eagle Saloon. The saloon was the social center of Copper Creek after sundown, where miners came to drink, play cards, and forget about their hard days in the copper pits. Jake pushed through the swinging doors and was greeted by the familiar sights and sounds of frontier nightlife. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls, and cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air. At the far end of the room, a piano player pounded out a lively tune while a few couples danced on the small wooden dance floor. "Evening, Sheriff," called out Tom Bradley, the saloon owner and bartender. Tom was a former cavalry sergeant who'd lost his left arm in an Indian fight years earlier, but he could still pour drinks and keep order better than most men with 2 arms. "Tom," Jake nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from the one-armed bartender. "How are things tonight?" "Quiet enough. Most of the boys are too tired from working the mines to cause much trouble. Though we did have some strangers come through earlier. 3 men on horseback looked like they might be trouble." Jake's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of trouble?" "Hard to say exactly, but they had that look about them, if you know what I mean. Kept their hats pulled low, didn't talk much, paid in silver coins that looked freshly minted. They asked a lot of questions about the town, who runs the bank, when the next shipment of copper goes out, that sort of thing." This was exactly the kind of information that made Jake's job challenging. Copper Creek's growing prosperity made it an attractive target for outlaws and bandits. The copper mine produced valuable ore that was shipped out monthly, and the town's bank held the payroll for over 100 miners and their families. "Did they say where they were headed?" Jake asked. "Claimed they were just passing through, but they bought supplies for a longer stay. My guess is they're camping somewhere in the hills, maybe planning something." Jake finished his coffee and stood up. "Thanks for the information, Tom. Keep your eyes open and let me know if you see them again." As Jake left the saloon and continued his evening patrol, his mind was divided between concern about potential trouble and thoughts of Catherine Wells. He wondered if she was settling in comfortably at the boarding house, and whether she might need any help getting the schoolhouse ready for her first students. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of another hot day ahead. Jake was in his office early, reviewing wanted posters and checking his equipment, when he heard a gentle knock on the door. "Come in," he called, and was surprised to see Catherine Wells enter, carrying a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Good morning, Sheriff Morrison," she said with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I brought you some fresh biscuits from Mrs. Henderson. She thought you might enjoy them with your morning coffee." Jake stood up quickly, removing his hat. "That's very kind of you, Miss Wells. Please have a seat." He gestured to the wooden chair across from his desk. Catherine sat down gracefully, smoothing her skirts. Today she wore a practical gray dress that was still feminine but better suited for the work she'd have to do preparing the schoolhouse. "I wanted to thank you for your help yesterday," she continued. "Mrs. Henderson is a lovely woman, and the room is quite comfortable. She told me so many stories about the founding of Copper Creek. It sounds like it was quite an adventure." "That it was," Jake agreed, pouring himself a cup of coffee and offering one to Catherine, who politely declined. 5 years ago, there was nothing here but desert and a few prospectors' claims. Now look at us. We've got over 300 people and more arriving every month. Mrs. Henderson also mentioned that you've been instrumental in keeping the peace during all this growth. That can't be easy work." Jake felt a flush of pride at her words, but also a touch of concern. "I do my best, Miss Wells, but I have to be honest with you, frontier life can be unpredictable. Yesterday, I heard about some strangers in town who might be planning trouble. I want you to be careful, especially when you're out at the schoolhouse by yourself. Catherine's expression grew serious. What kind of trouble are you expecting? Could be anything: claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, bandits looking to rob the ore shipments or the bank. The more prosperous Copper Creek becomes, the more it attracts the wrong kind of attention. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I didn't come all the way from Boston to hide in my room. I have work to do and I intend to do it. Her determination impressed Jake, but it also worried him. I understand, Miss Wells, and I admire your courage. Just promise me you'll be careful, and if you ever feel unsafe, you'll come to me for help. Catherine smiled. I promise, Sheriff Morrison. And please call me Catherine. If we're going to be working together to help this town grow, we should be friends. Jake felt his heart race at her use of the word friends, even as a part of him hoped they might become something more. In that case, Catherine, please call me Jake. After Catherine left, Jake found himself unable to concentrate on his paperwork. He kept thinking about her smile, her courage, and the way she said his name. He'd known her for less than 2 days, but already she was affecting him in ways that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. Around midday, Jake decided to walk over to the schoolhouse to check on Catherine's progress. The building sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with large windows to let in natural light. As he approached, he could hear Catherine inside, moving furniture and cleaning. Catherine? He called out as he knocked on the open door. Come in, Jake, her voice called back cheerfully. Jake entered to find Catherine standing on a chair, wiping down the windows with a damp cloth. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, and there was a streak of dust across her cheek, but she looked more beautiful than ever. Let me help you with that, Jake offered, reaching up to steady the chair. Thank you. These windows haven't been cleaned in months. I want everything to be perfect for the children when school starts next week. As Catherine climbed down from the chair, Jake found himself standing very close to her. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jake felt an almost overwhelming urge to reach out and brush the dust from her cheek. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. The place is looking good, he managed to say. The children are going to love having a real teacher. I hope so, Catherine replied, seeming slightly flustered by their close proximity. I've prepared lessons for different age groups, since I understand some of the older children have never had formal schooling. That's right. Most of them have been helping their families with mining or ranch work. But their parents know education is important for the future. As they talked about her plans for the school, Jake felt himself falling deeper under Catherine's spell. She was intelligent, passionate about her work, and genuinely cared about making a difference in the lives of the children. Everything about her appealed to him, which made his growing attraction both thrilling and terrifying. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching the schoolhouse. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his gun as he stepped to the window. 3 riders were approaching fast, kicking up clouds of dust. Catherine, stay back from the windows, Jake commanded, his voice suddenly stern and professional. The riders pulled up in front of the schoolhouse, and Jake recognized them as the strangers Tom Bradley had described. They were rough-looking men with several days' worth of beard growth and clothes that had seen better days. More importantly, they all wore guns low on their hips in the manner of experienced gunfighters. You the sheriff? Called out the leader, a lean man with cold gray eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. I am, Jake replied, stepping out onto the schoolhouse porch but keeping his hand near his weapon. What can I do for you, gentlemen? Name's Cole Brennan, the leader said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. These are my associates, Dutch Williams and Sam Carter. We're just passing through your fine town, and we wanted to pay our respects to the local law. Jake had heard the name Cole Brennan before. He was wanted for bank robbery and cattle rustling in 3 territories. The reward poster was probably sitting on Jake's desk right now. But 3 against 1 weren't good odds, especially with Catherine nearby. Well, you've paid your respects, Jake said evenly. I trust you'll be moving on soon. Oh, we might stay a day or 2, Brennan replied. Copper Creek looks like a prosperous place. Lot of opportunities for enterprising men like ourselves. The threat was barely veiled, but Jake couldn't make a move without endangering Catherine and potentially starting a gunfight in the middle of town. Just make sure you follow the law while you're here, Jake said firmly. We don't tolerate trouble in Copper Creek. Brennan's smile widened. We wouldn't dream of causing trouble, Sheriff. Would we, boys? His companions chuckled, and Jake felt his anger rising. But before he could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway beside him. Good afternoon, gentlemen, she said politely, though Jake could hear the tension in her voice. I'm Miss Wells, the new schoolteacher. Brennan's eyes lit up with interest as he took in Catherine's appearance. Well, a schoolmarm. And a mighty pretty one at that. Ma'am, Dutch Williams added, touching his hat brim with mock courtesy. Jake stepped slightly in front of Catherine, his jaw clenched. The lady is under my protection, he said quietly, but his words carried clear warning. Easy, Sheriff, Brennan said, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. We're just being neighborly. Isn't that right, Miss Wells? If you gentlemen will excuse us, we have work to do, Catherine said firmly, though Jake could see her hands trembling slightly. Of course, ma'am. We'll be seeing you around town, I'm sure. Brennan touched his hat brim and spurred his horse. The three outlaws rode back toward the main street, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in their wake. Who were they? Catherine asked once the riders were out of sight. Trouble, Jake replied grimly. Cole Brennan and his gang. They're wanted for robbery and worse. I need to get word to the territorial marshal, but that could take days. Catherine placed a gentle hand on Jake's arm. What will you do? The touch of her hand sent a shock through Jake's system, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate danger. Keep watching them, try to figure out what they're planning, and hope I can stop them before anyone gets hurt. Is there anything I can do to help? Jake turned to look at Catherine, seeing the genuine concern in her green eyes. In that moment, he realized that his feelings for her had gone far beyond simple attraction. He was falling in love with her, which made the current situation even more dangerous and complicated. Just be careful, he said softly. Stay close to town, don't go anywhere alone, and if you see those men again, get away and find me immediately. Catherine nodded. I will. But Jake, please be careful yourself. Copper Creek needs its sheriff. The way she said it made Jake wonder if she might be developing feelings for him as well. The thought filled him with hope and terror in equal measure. Over the next 3 days, Jake found himself caught in an increasingly complex web of duty and desire. By day, he watched Cole Brennan and his gang, trying to anticipate their next move while maintaining the normal routine of law enforcement in Copper Creek. By evening, he found excuses to check on Catherine, ostensibly for her safety but really because he couldn't stay away from her. The Brennan gang had taken rooms at the hotel and seemed to be settling in for an extended stay. They spent their days drinking at the Golden Eagle Saloon, playing cards, and asking subtle questions about the town's routines. Jake knew they were gathering information for some kind of job, but he couldn't prove it, and he couldn't arrest them for simply being in town. Meanwhile, Catherine had thrown herself into preparing for the opening of school. Jake had taken to stopping by the schoolhouse each afternoon, officially to check on security but really just to spend time with her. Their conversations ranged from practical matters about the town to deeper discussions about life, dreams, and the future of the frontier. You know, Catherine said one afternoon as they arranged desks in the schoolroom, when I decided to come west, everyone in Boston told me I was making a terrible mistake. What made you do it anyway? Jake asked, genuinely curious about what had brought this remarkable woman to his town. Catherine paused in her work, looking out the window at the desert landscape beyond Copper Creek. I suppose I wanted to make a real difference. In Boston, I was just another teacher in a city full of schools. Here, I have the chance to help shape the future of an entire community. That's a big responsibility, Jake observed. So is being a sheriff, Catherine replied with a smile. We both chose jobs that require us to put the welfare of others before our own comfort. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. She understood him in a way that few people ever had. Most folks saw the badge and the gun, but Catherine saw the man underneath who genuinely cared about protecting and serving his community. Their moment of connection was interrupted by the arrival of Billy Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's 12-year-old nephew who often ran errands around town. Sheriff Morrison. Billy called out as he burst through the schoolhouse door. My aunt sent me to find you. There's trouble at the bank. Jake's blood ran cold. What kind of trouble, Billy? 3 men with guns went in there about 10 minutes ago, and they haven't come out. Aunt Emma saw them from the boarding house window and sent me to get you. Jake's mind raced. The Brennan gang at the bank could only mean one thing. They were making their move. Catherine, I need you to stay here with Billy, Jake commanded, already checking his weapons. Lock the doors and don't come out until I come back for you. Jake, wait, Catherine started, but he was already heading for the door. Promise me you'll stay here, he said, turning back to look at her with intensity that made her step back. I promise, she whispered. Jake ran toward the main street, his mind calculating odds and options. 3 experienced gunmen against 1 sheriff wasn't good mathematics, but he couldn't wait for help that might never come. The people of Copper Creek were depending on him. As he approached the bank, Jake could see a small crowd gathering at a safe distance. Tom Bradley was there, along with Doc Peterson and several of the local merchants. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch of her boarding house, wringing her hands with worry. "Tom," Jake called quietly to the saloon keeper. "What's the situation?" "The three strangers went into the bank about 15 minutes ago. Haven't heard any shots, but old Mr. Jameson and his clerk are still in there. No one's come out." Jake studied the bank building, looking for advantages. The structure was adobe with thick walls and only 2 windows facing the street. There was a back door, but it would be difficult to approach without being seen. "I'm going to try to get closer and see what's happening," Jake told Tom. "If shooting starts, get everyone back to safety." Jake crossed the street carefully, keeping low and using the other buildings for cover. As he drew near the bank, he could hear voices inside, Cole Brennan's distinctive drawl and the frightened voice of Edgar Jameson, the elderly bank president. "Now, Mr. Jameson, this can go easy or hard, depending on how cooperative you want to be," Brennan was saying. "We know you've got the copper mine payroll in that safe, along with whatever other cash you keep on hand. Open her up and nobody has to get hurt." "Please, I've already given you everything in the cash drawer," Jameson pleaded. "The safe is on a time lock. It won't open until tomorrow morning." "That's a lie, old man," Dutch Williams snarled. "Banks don't keep payroll money locked up when the miners get paid every Saturday." Jake knew that today was indeed payday for the copper mine workers. The safe would contain several $1,000s in cash and silver, enough money to set up the Brennan gang for months. Moving carefully, Jake positioned himself next to one of the bank's front windows. Through the glass he could see the interior of the bank. Cole Brennan stood in front of the safe with his gun drawn, while Dutch Williams held a shotgun on Edgar Jameson and his young clerk, Timothy Walsh. Sam Carter was positioned near the front door, presumably as a lookout. Jake had to make a decision quickly. He could try to negotiate, but experienced outlaws like Brennan rarely left witnesses behind. He could try to get help, but by the time he returned, the robbery would be over and the gang would be long gone, possibly leaving behind 2 dead men. Taking a deep breath, Jake made his choice. He stepped around to the front door of the bank and called out loudly, "Cole Brennan. This is Sheriff Morrison. The bank is surrounded. Come out with your hands up and nobody has to get hurt." It was a bluff. Jake was completely alone, but he hoped it might create enough confusion to give him an advantage. The response was immediate. Sam Carter spun toward the door, raising his gun, while Brennan cursed loudly. "Sheriff's bluffing," Brennan shouted to his men. "There ain't enough law in this whole county to surround anybody. Carter, get rid of him." Sam Carter kicked open the bank door and stepped out onto the boardwalk, his gun already firing. Jake dove to the side as bullets splintered the wooden post where he'd been standing. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Jake rolled behind a water trough and returned fire, his Colt .45 bucking in his hand. Carter was a good shot, but he was also reckless, exposing himself too much as he tried to get a better angle on the sheriff. Jake's third shot caught Carter in the chest, and the outlaw spun around and collapsed on the boardwalk. But the gunfire had alerted the other 2 gang members, and Jake could hear them moving around inside the bank. "Dutch, watch the old man and the kid," Brennan called out. "I'll handle the sheriff." Jake heard the back door of the bank open and knew that Brennan was trying to circle around behind him. The situation was getting desperate. If Brennan got behind him, Jake would be caught in a crossfire with no chance of survival. Suddenly, Jake heard the sound of running footsteps, and Catherine Wells appeared beside the water trough carrying a rifle. "Catherine, what are you doing here?" Jake demanded, even as he felt a mixture of fear and admiration at her courage. "Mrs. Henderson had this rifle," Catherine said breathlessly. "I thought you might need help. You promised you'd stay at the schoolhouse. Billy told me you were facing 3 men alone. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing." Before Jake could argue further, Cole Brennan appeared at the corner of the building, his gun raised. Jake started to turn toward the new threat, but Catherine was already bringing the rifle to her shoulder. The rifle cracked and Brennan stumbled, clutching his left arm. His return shot went wide, and Jake was able to put a bullet center mass that dropped the gang leader permanently. Inside the bank, Dutch Williams realized that his companions were down. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway with his hands raised. "Don't shoot, Sheriff. I'm giving up." Jake kept his gun trained on Williams as the outlaw dropped his weapons and stepped out onto the street. Within minutes, the crisis was over. As Jake handcuffed the surviving gang member, he looked over at Catherine, who was sitting on the edge of the boardwalk with the rifle across her knees. Her hands were shaking slightly, and there was a stunned expression on her face. "Catherine, he said gently, kneeling beside her. Are you all right? I've never shot at a person before, she whispered. I've never even held a gun before today. Jake put his arm around her shoulders, offering what comfort he could. You saved my life and probably the lives of Mr. Jameson and Timothy. You did what you had to do. Is this what your life is like, Jake? Constant danger, always wondering if each day might be your last. Jake considered lying, telling her that the gunfight was unusual, but he respected Catherine too much for false reassurances. Sometimes, he admitted, being a lawman in the territories means facing danger, but it also means protecting people who can't protect themselves. That's worth the risk to me. Catherine looked up at him, and Jake saw something new in her green eyes, a deeper understanding of who he was and what his life entailed. I understand, she said quietly. But Jake, this changes things between us, doesn't it? Jake felt his heart constrict. He had been hoping that Catherine might be developing feelings for him, but witnessing the reality of frontier violence had clearly affected her deeply. What do you mean? He asked, though he was afraid he already knew. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching as Doc Peterson examined the bodies and a crowd of townspeople gathered to hear the details of the gunfight. I mean that I care about you, Jake Morrison, she said finally. More than I should, considering how little time we've known each other. But I also understand now what it would mean to care about a man whose job puts him in constant danger. Jake felt a ray of hope pierce through his concern. Catherine, are you saying? I'm saying that I need time to think, she interrupted gently. About what I want, about what kind of life I'm prepared to live, about whether I'm strong enough for this frontier life. Over the next few days, as Copper Creek returned to its normal rhythm, Jake found himself in emotional turmoil. The gunfight had been resolved successfully. Dutch Williams was locked in the town jail awaiting transport to the territorial prison, and the attempted bank robbery had been prevented. But the cost to Jake's personal life might be higher than he had anticipated. Catherine had returned to her work preparing the school, but there was a distance between them now that hadn't existed before. She was polite when they encountered each other, but she no longer sought out his company, and their conversations remained strictly professional. Jake threw himself into his duties, trying to distract himself from the growing ache in his chest. He filed reports about the bank robbery attempt, increased his patrols around town, and made sure that Dutch Williams was securely confined until the U.S. Marshal could take him to the territorial capital. 1 week after the bank incident, Jake was in his office cleaning his weapons when he heard a soft knock on the door. He looked up to see Catherine standing in the doorway carrying a small basket. I brought you some dinner, she said quietly. Mrs. Henderson thought you might be hungry. Jake set down his gun and gestured to the chair across from his desk. That's kind of both of you. Please sit down. Catherine settled into the chair, but Jake could see the tension in her posture. She had something to say and he suspected he wasn't going to like it. Jake, I've been thinking about what happened last week, she began, confirming his fears. Catherine, if you're having second thoughts about Copper Creek. I'm not, she interrupted. I love this town and I'm excited about teaching the children. The school opens tomorrow, and I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Jake felt confused. Then what? I'm having second thoughts about us, Catherine said quietly. About whether there can be in us. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. I see. Do you? Do you really understand what I'm trying to tell you? Jake stood up and walked to the window looking out at the main street of Copper Creek. I think you're saying that you don't want a relationship with a man whose job involves getting shot at. 1 week after the bank incident, Jake was in his office cleaning his weapons when he heard a soft knock on the door. He looked up to see Catherine standing in the doorway carrying a small basket. I brought you some dinner, she said quietly. Mrs. Henderson thought you might be hungry. Jake set down his gun and gestured to the chair across from his desk. That's kind of both of you. Please sit down. Catherine settled into the chair, but Jake could see the tension in her posture. She had something to say and he suspected he wasn't going to like it. Jake, I've been thinking about what happened last week, she began, confirming his fears. Catherine, if you're having second thoughts about Copper Creek. I'm not, she interrupted. I love this town and I'm excited about teaching the children. The school opens tomorrow, and I've never been more ready for anything in my life. Jake felt confused. Then what? I'm having second thoughts about us, Catherine said quietly. About whether there can be in us. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. I see. Do you? Do you really understand what I'm trying to tell you? Jake stood up and walked to the window looking out at the main street of Copper Creek. I think you're saying that you don't want a relationship with a man whose job involves getting shot at. That's part of it, Catherine admitted. But it's more complicated than that. Jake turned back to face her. Then help me understand. Catherine took a deep breath. When I came to Copper Creek, I thought I knew what I wanted. I wanted to make a difference, to help build something meaningful in this frontier town. I never expected to meet someone like you. Someone like me? Someone who would make me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Jake, when I saw you facing those outlaws, when I picked up that rifle, I discovered that I'm capable of things I never imagined. That scares me. Jake was beginning to understand. You're afraid of what loving me might turn you into. I'm afraid of losing myself, Catherine said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. In Boston, I was Miss Catherine Wells, schoolteacher and independent woman. Here I'm becoming someone different. Someone who can shoot at a man to protect the person she loves. The word love hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared to cross. Catherine, Jake said gently, moving back to sit across from her. What you did took courage. You saved lives. There's no shame in that. I know that in my head, she replied. But my heart is struggling with it. I've always believed in solving problems through education and understanding, not violence. Sometimes violence finds us whether we want it or not, Jake said. What matters is how we respond to it. Catherine looked up at him, and Jake could see the internal battle she was fighting. I need to know, Jake. Are you asking me to choose between who I was and who I might become? The question cut straight to the heart of Jake's own dilemma. He had fallen in love with Catherine Wells exactly as she was. Intelligent, strong, principled, and determined to make a difference through education. But he also lived in a world where violence was sometimes necessary, where the law was often enforced at gunpoint. No, he said finally. I would never ask you to change who you are. But I also can't change who I am or what my job requires. Then where does that leave us? Jake stood up and began pacing around the small office, his mind racing. I don't know, Catherine. I wish I had an answer that would make this simple, but I don't. Catherine watched him pace, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I love you, Jake Morrison. Jake stopped pacing and stared at her. What did you say? I said I love you. That's what makes this so difficult. If I didn't care about you, I could make a rational decision and move on with my life. But I do love you, and that terrifies me. Jake crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside Catherine's chair, taking her hands in his. Catherine, I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you step down from that stagecoach. Then what do we do? Catherine asked, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I don't know, Jake admitted. But I know I don't want to lose you. Maybe we can find a way to make this work. Catherine pulled her hands free and stood up. Jake, I need time to think. The school starts tomorrow and I need to focus on that right now. Can you give me that time? Jake nodded, even though every instinct told him to fight for her. Take all the time you need, Catherine. But please know that my feelings for you aren't going to change. Catherine reached out and touched his cheek gently. Nor will mine. That's what makes this so hard. After she left, Jake sat alone in his office, staring at the basket of food she had brought him. The aroma of fresh bread and stew filled the room, but he had no appetite. He had finally found the woman he wanted to spend his life with, and she was slipping away from him because of the very job that defined who he was. The next morning brought the official opening of Copper Creek's new school, and despite her personal turmoil, Catherine threw herself into her work with characteristic determination. Jake watched from across the street as 23 children of various ages filed into the schoolhouse, their parents beaming with pride and hope. Among the students was Billy Henderson, now clean and combed for the occasion, Sarah Martinez, the 10-year-old daughter of one of the mine foremen, and Tommy Morrison, Jake's own 8-year-old nephew whose parents had been killed in an Apache raid 2 years earlier. Jake had been raising the boy as his own, though he'd never officially adopted him. As the morning progressed, Jake found excuses to patrol near the school. He could hear Catherine's clear voice through the open windows as she conducted lessons, and the eager responses of children who had never experienced formal education before. During the lunch break, Tommy ran over to Jake with unbridled enthusiasm. Uncle Jake, Miss Wells is the best teacher ever. She's teaching us about numbers and letters, but also about places far away and how the government works. Did you know that President Chester Arthur used to be a schoolteacher too? Jake smiled at his nephew's excitement. Is that so? What else did you learn? Miss Wells said that education is the foundation of civilization, and that every person deserves the chance to learn and grow. She said that here in the territories, We're helping to build the future of America. The boy's words struck Jake deeply. Catherine wasn't just teaching children to read and write, she was instilling in them the values and dreams that would shape the next generation of Americans. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had talked about wanting to do. That afternoon, Jake was reviewing correspondence from the territorial marshal when Dr. Samuel Peterson rushed into his office. "Sheriff, we've got trouble," the elderly physician said breathlessly. "There's been an accident at the copper mine. Cave-in trapped 4 men, and we need all the help we can get." Jake was on his feet immediately, strapping on his gun belt. Mine accidents were unfortunately common in the territory, and every able-bodied man would be needed for the rescue effort. "How bad is it, Doc?" "Bad enough. The mine foreman thinks the men are still alive. They can hear tapping from behind the cave-in, but it's going to take hours to dig them out. We need to organize teams, get supplies, and pray we can reach them in time." As Jake hurried toward the mine with Doc Peterson, he saw that school had been dismissed early. Parents were gathering their children and rushing toward the mine site to help with the rescue efforts. In a frontier community, everyone pulled together during times of crisis. At the mine entrance, Jake found controlled chaos. Mine Superintendent Henry Walsh was directing the rescue efforts, while teams of volunteers took turns with picks and shovels, carefully removing rocks and debris from the collapsed tunnel. "Sheriff Morrison," Walsh called out as Jake approached. "Thank God you're here. We can use your help organizing the volunteers and keeping everyone safe." For the next several hours, Jake found himself coordinating the rescue effort, ensuring that the volunteer crews rotated regularly to prevent exhaustion, and maintaining order as word of the accident spread throughout Copper Creek and the surrounding area. As evening approached, Jake was surprised to see Catherine arrive at the mine site carrying baskets of food and several large pots of coffee. "I thought the rescue workers might be hungry," she explained as she began setting up an impromptu feeding station. Several other women from town had joined her, including Mrs. Henderson and Maria Santos, the wife of one of the trapped miners. Jake watched as Catherine moved among the exhausted, dirt-covered men, offering food, coffee, and words of encouragement. She had changed from her schoolteacher's dress into a more practical outfit, and her hair was tied back with a simple ribbon, but Jake thought she had never looked more beautiful. "She's quite a woman," Henry Walsh commented, following Jake's gaze. "Yes, she is," Jake agreed. "Maria Santos is beside herself with worry about her husband. Miss Wells has been sitting with her, keeping her calm and hopeful. That teacher of yours has a good heart." Jake felt a surge of pride, followed immediately by the familiar ache of uncertainty about their future together. The rescue effort continued through the night. Just after dawn, the rescue teams finally broke through to the trapped miners. All 4 men were alive, though 2 had suffered broken bones and all were dehydrated and exhausted. As the injured miners were carried out and loaded into wagons for transport to Doc Peterson's clinic, Jake felt the satisfaction that came with a successful rescue. The community had come together, lives had been saved, and once again Copper Creek had proven its resilience and solidarity. Catherine was helping to clean up the feeding area when Jake approached her. "Thank you," he said simply. "What you did here tonight made a real difference." "It's what neighbors do for each other," Catherine replied, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Let me walk you back to town," Jake offered. As they walked together in the early morning light, neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Catherine broke the silence. "Jake, watching you organize that rescue effort, seeing how much the people of this town depend on you and trust you, it helped me understand something important." Jake felt his heart rate increase. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about this all wrong. I was so focused on what your job might cost us that I wasn't considering what your job gives to this community. You're not just a man who carries a gun and enforces laws. You're a leader, a protector, someone people turn to when they need help." Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "Catherine, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I was trying to separate Jake Morrison, the man, from Sheriff Morrison, the lawman, but they're the same person. The qualities that make you good at your job, your courage, your sense of justice, your willingness to put others before yourself, those are the same qualities that made me fall in love with you." Jake felt hope beginning to bloom in his chest, but he was afraid to trust it completely. "Does this mean?" "It means I want to try," Catherine said, stepping closer to him. "I want to see if we can build something together. I'm still scared, Jake. I'm still not sure I'm strong enough for this life. But I know I love you, and I think that might be enough." Jake reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands. "Catherine, I love you more than I thought possible. We'll figure out the rest together." "Promise me something," Catherine said, placing her hands over his. "Anything. Promise me you'll be careful." Not just for your own sake but for mine. I couldn't bear to lose you now that I've found you. I promise, Jake said, leaning down to kiss her gently. As their lips met, Jake felt as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. The woman he loved was willing to take a chance on them, and that was more than he had dared to hope for. Chapter 5. Building a Future. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Jake's life. His relationship with Catherine developed slowly and naturally, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and growing intimacy. They took walks together in the evenings, sharing their dreams and fears about the future. Catherine told him about her childhood in Boston, her decision to become a teacher, and her hopes for the school in Copper Creek. Jake opened up about his own past, his service as a cavalry scout, the death of his brother and sister-in-law that had left him responsible for young Tommy, and his decision to become a lawman. The school was thriving under Catherine's guidance. The children were making remarkable progress, and their parents were beginning to see the practical benefits of education. Tommy Morrison, in particular, seemed to blossom under Catherine's teaching, displaying a quick mind and natural leadership abilities. One evening in early November, as Jake and Catherine sat on the porch of the boarding house watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant shades of orange and red, Catherine brought up a subject that had been on both of their minds. "Jake, I've been thinking about Tommy," she said carefully. "What about him? He's a bright boy with tremendous potential, but he's also carrying a lot of pain from losing his parents. Have you considered making the arrangement with him more permanent?" Jake had been thinking about adopting Tommy officially, but he hadn't known how to bring up the subject. "You mean adopting him legally?" "Exactly. He clearly thinks of you as his father, and you've been raising him as your son. Making it official would give him the security of knowing he truly belongs somewhere." Jake considered this. "What made you think about it?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I've been thinking about what family means and what kind of family I might want to be part of someday." The implications of her words made Jake's heart race. "Catherine, are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love that boy almost as much as I love his uncle," Catherine said, turning to look directly at Jake. "And if we're going to build a future together, I want Tommy to be part of it." Jake felt overwhelmed by emotion. The woman he loved was not only willing to accept the responsibility of Tommy, but actively wanted the boy to be part of their family. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "I've been corresponding with some educators back east about starting a teacher's training program here in the territory. If we could attract more qualified teachers, we could establish schools in other growing communities." "That's a wonderful idea," Jake said. "But it would mean a lot of travel, a lot of time away from Copper Creek." "Not necessarily. We could establish a central training facility right here, and bring the potential teachers to us. Copper Creek could become known as an educational center for the entire territory." Jake was impressed by the scope of Catherine's vision. She wasn't content to simply teach children. She wanted to help build an entire educational infrastructure for the developing territory. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a familiar figure, Territorial Marshal William Hayes, a grizzled veteran lawman whom Jake had worked with before. "Evening, Sheriff Morrison, Miss Wells," Marshal Hayes said, touching his hat brim politely. "Marshal Hayes," Jake replied, standing and shaking the older man's hand. "What brings you to Copper Creek?" "Official business, I'm afraid. Mind if we talk privately?" Jake glanced at Catherine, who immediately understood. "I should check on my lesson plans for tomorrow anyway," she said, rising gracefully. "Good evening, Marshal Hayes." After Catherine had gone inside, Marshal Hayes got straight to the point. "Jake, I've got a proposition for you. The territorial governor is looking to appoint a new chief of territorial police, and your name has come up." Jake felt surprised and flattered. The position of territorial police chief was one of the most prestigious law enforcement jobs in Arizona territory, carrying significant authority and responsibility. "I'm honored, Marshal, but I'm not sure I understand. What would the job involve?" "You'd be based in Tucson with responsibility for coordinating law enforcement across the entire territory. Better pay, more authority, and a chance to help shape law enforcement policy as we move toward statehood." Jake's mind raced. It was an incredible opportunity, the kind of career advancement he had never imagined possible. But it would also mean leaving Copper Creek, leaving the community he had sworn to protect. "What about Copper Creek?" Jake asked. "The town needs a sheriff. We'd find someone to replace you. Probably promote your deputy or bring in someone from outside." Jake thought about his deputy, Pete Hawkins, a good man but inexperienced and lacking the judgment needed for the complex challenges of frontier law enforcement. "Marshal, this is a big decision. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course. But I'll need an answer within 2 weeks. The governor wants to make the appointment before the end of the year. After Marshal Hayes left, Jake sat alone on the porch, his mind churning. The job offer represented everything he had worked toward as a lawman: recognition, advancement, the chance to make a real difference on a territorial level. But it also meant leaving behind everything he had built in Copper Creek, including his relationship with Catherine. The next morning, Jake found himself distracted during his usual patrol of the town. He kept thinking about the marshal's offer, weighing the pros and cons, trying to imagine what his life might look like in either scenario. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching from the east. Jake looked up to see a lone rider galloping toward town, clearly in distress. As the rider drew closer, Jake recognized him as Miguel Santos, one of the mine workers. "Sheriff Morrison." Miguel called out as he pulled his lathered horse to a halt. "You must come quickly. There are men with guns at the mine. They're holding the workers hostage." Jake felt his blood run cold. How many men? What do they want? 6 or 7, maybe more. They came at dawn just as the morning shift was arriving. They've got everyone locked in the equipment shed and they're demanding the company turn over all the silver and copper ore that's been stockpiled for shipment. Jake's mind immediately went to Catherine and the schoolchildren. The mine was only 2 miles from town, close enough that any violence there could spill over into Copper Creek itself. "Miguel, ride to the schoolhouse and tell Miss Wells to dismiss school immediately and get the children to safety. Then spread the word through town. Everyone should stay indoors until this is over." As Miguel rode off toward the school, Jake ran to his office to gather additional weapons and ammunition. This was exactly the kind of situation that made his job dangerous and unpredictable, and exactly the kind of thing that made Catherine worry about their future together. Jake was loading extra cartridges into his gun belt when Catherine burst through his office door. "Jake, Miguel told me what happened." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to the mine to assess the situation and see if I can negotiate with whoever's in charge," Jake replied, checking his rifle. "Alone? Against 6 or 7 armed men? I've sent word to Marshal Hayes and the army post at Fort Apache, but help could be hours away. In the meantime, those miners are in immediate danger." Catherine grabbed his arm. "Jake, this is madness. You can't take on that many men by yourself." Jake looked into her frightened green eyes and felt his resolve waver. This was exactly what Catherine had been afraid of. Him riding into almost certain danger because his job demanded it. "Catherine, I have to go. Those men have families, children. I can't just sit here and wait for help while they might be killed." "Then take me with you," Catherine said firmly. "Absolutely not. Jake, think about it logically. If these men are holding the miners for ransom, they might be willing to negotiate. A woman's presence might help defuse the situation. Or it might make things worse. Catherine, I need you to stay in town where you're safe." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see the fear and frustration in her expression. "This is our life, isn't it?" she said quietly. "You riding off into danger while I stay behind and worry whether you'll come back alive." Jake felt his heart breaking. "Catherine." "Go," she said, stepping back. "Do what you have to do. But Jake Morrison, you better come back to me, do you hear?" Jake nodded, unable to trust his voice. He kissed her quickly and headed for the door, grabbing his hat and rifle on the way out. The ride to the copper mine took Jake 20 minutes, during which his mind raced through possible strategies and outcomes. As he approached the mining operation, he could see that the situation was as serious as Miguel had indicated. Several armed men were positioned around the mine buildings, and Jake could see the equipment shed where the miners were presumably being held. Jake dismounted about a quarter-mile from the mine and approached on foot, using the natural terrain for cover. As he got closer, he could hear voices. Someone was shouting orders, though Jake couldn't make out the words from his position. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Jake managed to get within 100 yards of the main building. From there, he could see that the bandits had positioned themselves strategically around the mine complex, covering all the approaches. Their leader appeared to be a tall man with a black beard who was directing the others with military precision. "You men in there," the leader shouted toward the equipment shed. "We're going to give your boss 1 more hour to bring us that or we start shooting miners." Jake recognized the voice. It belonged to Captain Joshua Garrett, a former Union Army officer who had turned to banditry after the war. Garrett was known throughout the territory for his ruthless tactics and military approach to robbery. If he was involved, the situation was even more dangerous than Jake had initially thought. Jake studied the layout carefully, looking for any advantage he could exploit. The bandits had chosen their positions well, but they were also spread thin trying to cover such a large area. If Jake could create a diversion, he might be able to get to the equipment shed and free some of the miners. As Jake was formulating his plan, he heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking back toward town, he was horrified to see Catherine riding toward the mine, along with 4 other men: Tom Bradley from the saloon, Doc Peterson, Henry Walsh the mine superintendent, and Pete Hawkins, Jake's deputy. Jake cursed under his breath. Catherine had ignored his instructions to stay safe and had instead organized a rescue party. While he appreciated the help, her presence put her in terrible danger and complicated his tactical options. The small group from Copper Creek approached openly, with Henry Walsh carrying a white flag. They stopped about 50 yards from the mine buildings, clearly hoping to negotiate. "Captain Garrett," Walsh called out. "I'm Henry Walsh, superintendent of this mine. I understand you have some of my workers. What do you want?" Garrett appeared from behind one of the buildings, his rifle trained on the negotiating party. "Walsh, you're just the man I wanted to see. I want all the refined copper and silver you've got stockpiled for shipment, loaded into wagons and brought here within the hour. Captain, that ore is worth thousands of dollars. Surely we can work out some other arrangement." "The only arrangement I'm interested in is getting that ore. Every minute you delay costs the life of one of your workers." Jake watched the exchange with growing alarm. Garrett was clearly not interested in genuine negotiation. He was simply making demands and backing them up with threats of violence. From his concealed position, Jake could see Catherine among the group from town, and his heart clenched with fear for her safety. She was wearing men's clothing and had her hair tucked up under a hat, probably hoping to be less noticeable, but Jake knew that if shooting started, everyone in that exposed position would be in mortal danger. Suddenly, Jake heard movement behind him. He spun around to find himself facing 2 of Garrett's men who had flanked his position. Well, one of them said with a nasty grin. "If it ain't the famous Sheriff Morrison. Captain's been hoping you'd show up." Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but the second bandit was already covering him with a rifle. "I wouldn't if I were you, Sheriff. Captain wants to talk to you." With no choice but to comply, Jake allowed himself to be marched into the open where Garrett waited with obvious satisfaction. "Sheriff Morrison," Garrett said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How good of you to join us. Now we can discuss terms properly." "What terms?" Jake replied. "Seems to me you're the one making demands." "True enough. But now that you're here I can sweeten the deal. I'll trade you all of these miners for the ore and safe passage out of the territory. 1 lawman's life for 20 workers. That seems like good mathematics to me." Jake felt the eyes of everyone present on him. It was the kind of impossible choice that frontier lawmen sometimes faced: sacrifice himself to save innocent lives, or risk those lives in a fight that might save everyone or might get them all killed. "Captain," Catherine's voice rang out clearly and Jake felt his blood freeze. "What if we could offer you something better than the ore?" Garrett turned his attention to the small figure in men's clothing. "And what might that be, boy?" "Not ore but cash. The bank in Copper Creek has the payroll for all the mines in this district. It would be easier to transport than ore and worth more." Jake stared at Catherine in shock. She was offering to lead these bandits to rob the bank in Copper Creek, the very bank where Jake had faced down the Brennan gang months earlier. "Interesting proposition," Garrett mused. "But how do I know this isn't some kind of trick?" "Because I'm the schoolteacher in Copper Creek," Catherine replied, pulling off her hat and letting her auburn hair fall free. "I know how much money comes through that bank because I help keep the school district's accounts. There's over $10,000 in cash right now." Garrett's eyes lit up with greed, but Jake could also see the suspicion there. "A schoolteacher offering to help rob a bank? That's not very likely, is it?" "A schoolteacher trying to save the lives of 20 innocent men," Catherine corrected. "Sometimes we have to make difficult choices, Captain." Jake began to understand what Catherine was doing. She was trying to move the confrontation away from the mine, where the workers were trapped and helpless, to the town where Jake might have more tactical advantages. It was brilliant, but it was also incredibly dangerous. "What guarantee do I have that this isn't an ambush?" Garrett asked. "You have me," Catherine replied. "I'll ride with you as a guarantee of good faith. If it's a trap, you can kill me first." "Catherine, no!" Jake shouted, but one of Garrett's men clubbed him with a rifle sending him to his knees. Garrett studied Catherine for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of her proposal. Finally he nodded. "All right, schoolteacher. We'll try it your way. But if this is some kind of trick, I'll kill everyone here starting with your sheriff." "I understand," Catherine replied calmly, though Jake could see her hands trembling slightly. "Jones, Miller, stay here and watch the miners," Garrett ordered his men. "The rest of us will ride to town with our new friend here." As the bandits prepared to leave for Copper Creek, Jake caught Catherine's eye and tried to communicate his understanding of her plan through his expression. She nodded slightly, confirming that they were thinking along the same lines. The ride back to town was tense and silent. Jake, his hands tied behind his back, rode between two of Garrett's men while Catherine rode beside Garrett himself. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of ways to turn the situation to their advantage once they reached Copper Creek. As they approached the town, Jake could see that word of the crisis had spread. The streets were deserted, and Jake caught glimpses of faces peering out from behind curtains and partially open doors. The townspeople were ready for trouble. Garrett called a halt at the edge of town and surveyed the main street carefully. "Looks quiet enough," he muttered. "But I don't like it. Too quiet." "The bank is just down the street," Catherine said, pointing to the adobe building. "If you let me talk to the banker, I can convince him to open the safe without violence." "Nice try, schoolteacher, but we'll do this my way. Johnson, take 2 men and circle around behind the bank. Williams, you and Smith watch the street. If anyone so much as sticks their nose out of a building, shoot them." As Garrett's men took their positions, Jake realized that Catherine's plan had worked better than either of them had hoped. By bringing the bandits into town, she had moved them into Jake's territory where he knew every building, every alley, every potential advantage. "Captain," Jake said, "you're making a mistake. The people of this town aren't going to just stand by while you rob their bank." "Then they'll die," Garrett replied coldly. "I've got no patience for heroes, Sheriff." As they approached the bank, Jake saw a movement in the window of Tom Bradley's saloon. The one-armed bartender was positioning himself with a rifle, ready to provide covering fire if needed. Jake also caught a glimpse of Doc Peterson in the doorway of his clinic, and he suspected that other townspeople were similarly positioned throughout the main street. "All right, schoolteacher," Garrett said as they reached the bank. "Time to keep your promise. Get that banker to open up." Catherine dismounted and walked to the bank door, with Garrett close behind her. Jake, still on horseback with his hands tied, watched tensely as she knocked on the door. "Mr. Jameson," Catherine called out. "It's Catherine Wells. Please open the door, we need to talk." The door opened cautiously and Edgar Jameson peered out. His eyes widened as he saw the armed men surrounding Catherine. "Miss Wells, what's happening?" "Mr. Jameson, these men are holding Sheriff Morrison and the miners from the copper mine. They're demanding access to the bank's cash reserves." Jameson's face went pale, but to his credit, he stood his ground. "I'm sorry, Miss Wells, but I cannot and will not open this bank to robbers." Garrett pushed past Catherine and grabbed Jameson by the shirt front. "Old man, you'll open that safe or I'll start shooting people, beginning with your precious schoolteacher." "Wait," Jake called out, desperate to buy time. "Garrett, what you really want is safe passage out of the territory. Let me make you a deal." "I'm listening, Sheriff." "There's a shipment of silver coming through Copper Creek tomorrow, $20,000 worth, bound for the mint in Denver. Let these people go, and I'll tell you exactly when and where you can intercept it." Garrett's eyes narrowed with suspicion and greed. "How do I know you're not lying?" "Because I'm the one who arranged the security for the shipment," Jake replied. "I know the route, the timing, everything. It was a complete fabrication. There was no silver shipment, but Jake was counting on Garrett's greed to make him consider the offer seriously. $20,000? Garrett mused. "That would set us up for a long time." "Captain," one of his men called out nervously, "I don't like this. There are too many people around, too many places for an ambush." Garrett looked around at the quiet street, clearly sensing the same tension his subordinate had noticed. "You're right. This whole setup stinks of a trap." Jake's heart sank as he realized Garrett wasn't going to take the bait. The bandit leader was too experienced to be easily fooled. "All right," Garrett announced loudly. "New plan. We take what cash is in the bank right now, plus the sheriff and the schoolteacher as hostages. That should guarantee us safe passage." Jake felt desperation rising in his chest. If Garrett succeeded in taking Catherine hostage, her chances of survival would be slim. Bandits like Garrett rarely left witnesses behind. "Garrett," Jake called out, playing his last card. "Before you do anything stupid, you should know that this town is surrounded by a company of cavalry from Fort Apache. They're waiting for my signal to attack." It was another bluff, but Jake put all his conviction behind it. Garrett laughed harshly. "Sheriff, you're a terrible liar. If there was cavalry here, they'd have already made their move." As if summoned by Jake's desperate fabrication, the sound of military bugles suddenly echoed from the hills surrounding Copper Creek. Everyone froze, staring in amazement as blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers appeared on the ridgelines around the town. Jake was as surprised as anyone. He had no idea how or why the cavalry had arrived, but he wasn't about to question good fortune. "Last chance, Garrett," Jake called out. "Surrender now and you might live to see a territorial prison. Fight and you'll die right here in the street." Garrett looked around wildly, clearly trying to assess his options. His men were beginning to panic, realizing they were outnumbered and surrounded. "Captain," one of them shouted, "we need to get out of here." "Shut up," Garrett snarled. "I'm thinking." In that moment of confusion, Catherine acted. She dove behind the water trough in front of the bank just as Tom Bradley opened fire from the saloon window. The one-armed bartender's shot took down one of Garrett's men immediately. The street erupted in gunfire as the townspeople joined the battle. Jake rolled off his horse and managed to work his way behind a wooden post, frantically trying to free his hands from the ropes that bound them. Garrett, realizing his position was hopeless, made a desperate attempt to reach his horse. But as he ran across the street, Doc Peterson stepped out of his clinic with an old army rifle and put a bullet squarely in the bandit leader's chest. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Garrett and 3 of his men were dead, while 2 others had surrendered. Jake had managed to free himself and was helping Catherine to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked anxiously, checking her for wounds. "I'm fine," Catherine replied, though Jake could see she was shaking with adrenaline. "Jake, where did the cavalry come from?" Before Jake could answer, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Sheriff Morrison. Miss Wells. Are you both all right?" Jake looked up to see Marshal Hayes approaching with a cavalry lieutenant. "Marshal Hayes," Jake said with relief. "Perfect timing. We were already on our way here when we heard the shooting," Hayes explained. "Lieutenant Patterson here was bringing you some news about that job offer we discussed." Jake had completely forgotten about the territorial police position in the excitement of the last few hours. "What news?" Catherine asked, overhearing the conversation. Lieutenant Patterson stepped forward. "Sheriff Morrison, I'm afraid the position has been filled by someone else. The governor decided to appoint a candidate from Tucson instead." Jake felt a complex mixture of disappointment and relief. The job opportunity was gone, but that meant he wouldn't have to choose between his career advancement and his life in Copper Creek. "I'm sorry, Jake," Marshal Hayes said. "I know you were considering the offer. Actually, Marshal, I've had time to think about it, and I believe my place is right here in Copper Creek." Jake looked at Catherine as he spoke, and saw understanding and joy in her green eyes. "Besides," Jake continued, "this town seems to need its sheriff. And I've got too much invested here to leave now." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning in 1883, the town of Copper Creek was preparing for its most joyous celebration in years. White ribbons and wildflowers decorated the main street, and the small church at the end of town had been cleaned and polished until it shone. Sheriff Jake Morrison stood in front of the church's simple altar, wearing his best suit and feeling more nervous than he had ever felt facing down armed outlaws. Beside him stood Tom Bradley as his best man, the one-armed saloon keeper grinning with pride at being chosen for the honor. The church was packed with the entire population of Copper Creek, all dressed in their finest clothes for the wedding of their sheriff and schoolteacher. In the front row sat Tommy Morrison, now officially Jake's adopted son, beaming with excitement at the prospect of finally having a mother. As the church door opened and Catherine appeared in a simple but beautiful white dress, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. She was radiant, her auburn hair crowned with a wreath of desert wildflowers, her green eyes sparkling with joy and love. Doc Peterson's wife had volunteered to play the organ, and as the familiar strains of the wedding march filled the small church, Catherine walked down the aisle toward Jake, her hand resting on the arm of Henry Walsh, who had volunteered to give her away. As Catherine reached the altar and took Jake's hands in hers, Reverend Johnson opened his worn Bible and began the ceremony that would unite them as husband and wife. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Jacob Morrison and Catherine Wells, 2 people who have found love in the midst of the frontier challenges and have chosen to build their future together." Jake barely heard the Reverend's words. He was lost in Catherine's eyes, thinking about everything they had been through together and everything they had yet to experience. The gunfights, the difficult decisions, the moments of doubt and fear, all of it had led to this moment. When the time came for vows, Jake spoke from his heart. "Catherine, when you stepped off that stagecoach 6 months ago, you changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. You've made me a better man, a better lawman, and now you're making me the happiest man in the Arizona Territory. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you through whatever challenges we face together." Catherine's voice was clear and strong as she made her own vows. "Jake, you showed me that love doesn't mean giving up who you are, it means becoming who you're meant to be. You've taught me that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to love someone despite the risks. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your work, and to help build the kind of community where our children can grow up with hope and opportunity." When Reverend Johnson pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed his new bride, the entire church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and a feast that had been prepared by the entire community. Jake and Catherine danced their first dance as husband and wife to a fiddle tune played by one of the miners, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become their extended family. As the evening wound down, Jake and Catherine stood on the porch of their new home, a small house that the town had built for them as a wedding gift, looking out at the desert landscape that had brought them together. "Any regrets, Mrs. Morrison?" Jake asked, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind. "Only one," Catherine replied, leaning back against his chest. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What's that?" Catherine turned in his arms, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I regret that it took us so long to get to this point." Jake laughed and kissed her forehead. "Well, Mrs. Morrison, we've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." 5 years later, Sheriff Jake Morrison stood on the same boardwalk where he had first seen Catherine Wells step down from the stagecoach. Copper Creek had grown considerably in those 5 years. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing with it new businesses, more families, and the steady march of civilization into the Arizona Territory. The town now boasted 3 schools, with Catherine serving as the superintendent of education for the entire district. Her teacher training program had become famous throughout the territory, attracting educators from as far away as California and Texas. The children she had taught in that first one-room schoolhouse were now young adults, many of them attending universities back east, while others had started businesses or farms of their own. Jake's reputation had grown as well. He had been elected sheriff 5 times without opposition, and his methods of community-based law enforcement had become a model for other frontier towns. The badge he wore now was silver rather than tin, a gift from the territorial governor in recognition of his service. Tommy Morrison, now 13 and preparing to enter high school, had grown into a fine young man who showed every sign of following in his adoptive father's footsteps. He often accompanied Jake on routine patrols, learning the responsibilities that came with serving and protecting a community. But the most significant change in Jake's life stood beside him now, his wife Catherine holding their 2-year-old daughter Sarah in her arms while their 4-year-old son James played with a wooden horse on the boardwalk nearby. "The afternoon stage is late," Catherine observed, shading her eyes against the desert sun. "Probably delayed by the rain up north," Jake replied. "Tom Bradley said the roads have been muddy for the past week." As if summoned by their conversation, the familiar sound of hoofbeats and creaking wheels announced the arrival of the Wells Fargo stage. Jake and Catherine watched as it rolled down the main street, much as they had that first day when their lives had changed forever. Among the passengers who stepped down from the coach was a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes, carrying a leather satchel and looking around with the mixture of apprehension and determination that Jake recognized from his first encounter with Catherine. "Excuse me," the young woman said, approaching Jake and Catherine. "I'm looking for Sheriff Morrison. I'm Miss Elizabeth Harper, the new teacher for the mining camp at Silver Creek." Jake smiled and touched his hat brim. "I'm Sheriff Morrison, and this is my wife Catherine, who runs our educational district. Welcome to Arizona Territory, Miss Harper." As Jake watched Catherine take the young teacher under her wing, just as Mrs. Henderson had done for her years earlier, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them all to this point. The frontier was changing rapidly. Arizona Territory was moving closer to statehood every year, and towns like Copper Creek were becoming permanent fixtures on the American landscape. The days of constant danger, of outlaws and Indian raids, were largely behind them, replaced by the more mundane but equally important challenges of building lasting communities. Jake's role as sheriff had evolved as well. Where once he had spent most of his time chasing cattle rustlers and bank robbers, he now focused more on settling disputes, enforcing municipal ordinances, and helping to maintain the social fabric that held the growing community together. That evening, as Jake made his final rounds through town, he stopped at the cemetery on the hill overlooking Copper Creek. Among the neat rows of graves were several that marked important chapters in the town's history: the original prospectors who had discovered copper, the miners who had died in cave-ins, and the brave men who had fought to protect their community from those who would exploit it. Near the back of the cemetery stood a simple stone marker that read, "Captain Joshua Garrett and Associates, they chose poorly." It had been Jake's idea to bury the outlaws in the town cemetery rather than in unmarked graves, believing that even bad men deserved basic human dignity in death. As Jake stood among the graves, thinking about the price of civilization and the cost of progress, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Catherine walking up the hill toward him, carrying a lantern. "I thought I might find you here," she said, slipping her hand into his. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Jake replied. "Sometimes I wonder if the children growing up here now can even imagine what it was like in the early days." "That's why we write it down, why we preserve the stories," Catherine said. "So they'll know what it took to build the world they're inheriting." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking down at the lights of Copper Creek twinkling in the gathering darkness. The town that had brought them together had become something neither of them could have imagined. A thriving community where families could put down roots and children could dream of futures that extended far beyond the desert horizon. "Catherine," Jake said suddenly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gotten on that stagecoach in Boston? If you had stayed in the safe, comfortable life you knew?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I think about Sarah and James, about Tommy, about all the children I've taught and the teachers I've trained. I think about the difference we've made together, and I know I chose the right path. Even with all the danger, all the uncertainty?" "Especially because of the danger and uncertainty," Catherine replied firmly. "Safe lives rarely change the world, Jake. It's the people who are willing to take risks, to venture into the unknown, who make the real difference." Jake squeezed her hand. "I love you, Catherine Morrison. And I love you, Jake Morrison. Now come on home. Tommy is reading Sarah a bedtime story, and James is asking for his daddy." As they walked back down the hill toward their house, Jake reflected on the truth of what Catherine had said. The American frontier had been settled by people who were willing to take risks, to leave behind the familiar and comfortable in pursuit of something better. It was that spirit of adventure and determination that had built places like Copper Creek, and it was that same spirit that would carry the territory forward into statehood and beyond. The secret love that had once seemed so complicated and dangerous had become the foundation for a family, a community, and a way of life that embodied the best of what America could be. Jake Morrison had started as a lawman torn between duty and desire, but he had discovered that true happiness came from understanding that the best duties were the ones that aligned with the deepest desires of the heart. Behind them, the lights of Copper Creek continued to twinkle in the darkness, a beacon of civilization in the vast Arizona desert, built by people who had dared to dream of something better and had been willing to work and fight to make those dreams reality. And in years to come, when historians wrote about the settlement of the American West, they would record the facts and figures, the dates and statistics. But they would miss the most important story of all, the story of ordinary people who found extraordinary love and courage in the face of an uncertain future, and who used that love and courage to build something lasting and beautiful in the wilderness. The sheriff's secret love had become the foundation for a legacy that would endure long after the frontier days were just a memory. In the end, Jake Morrison and Catherine Wells had discovered that the greatest adventure of all was not the one that took them across dangerous territories, but the one that took them into each other's hearts. As they reached their front porch and could hear the laughter of their children inside, Jake paused to kiss his wife under the vast canopy of desert stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve their community and protect the people they loved. But tonight, the sheriff and his schoolteacher were simply a husband and wife, grateful for the journey that had brought them together and excited about the future they would continue to build, one day at a time in the heart of the American frontier.